The fog clung low that morning, curling around the chimneys of St. Mary Mead like smoke from an unseen fire. The village stretched in quiet repose, the cobblestone lanes still slick from the previous night's rain. Shops hadn't yet rolled up their blinds, and the small tea room stood dark and shuttered. It was a place poised between the old world and the new, a picture postcard of English life, where gossip moved faster than the milk carts. Miss Marple stood in her garden, examining a patch of petunias that had taken a battering from a recent downpour. She was dressed neatly, as always, in a wool cardigan and sturdy shoes that kept her steady on the soft, rain-soaked ground. Her eyes wandered, not just to the flowers, but up and over the garden wall. Nothing escaped her notice. A scarf lay crumpled on the far side of the lane, bright blue against the grey cobbles. She made a note of it, mentally of course, and returned to snipping the damaged blooms. Behind her, in a row of terraced cottages, a window creaked open. A voice, Mrs. Simpson's, shrill as ever, called out, "Did you hear about the vicar's new housekeeper? She's from London, they say." Another voice answered, lower and conspiratorial. It wasn't that Miss Marple meant to listen, it was simply that in a village like St. Mary Mead, even a whisper could carry through the morning fog. The clock tower struck 8, its chime cutting through the still air. Miss Marple looked up, just in time to catch the faint, distant sound of a train approaching. The express from Paddington, she thought, always reliable, that train. The faint rumble sent a shiver of energy through the waking village. Something in the air felt different today, off, somehow. But she kept that thought to herself. The railway station in St. Mary Mead wasn't much more than a platform with a roof. A few wooden benches lined the far side, and a small windowed office stood in the middle like a child's toy station house. A single gas lamp, still lit from the night, cast a faint golden glow over the damp platform. As the train pulled in, steam hissed against the rails. The passengers disembarked in ones and twos, a man with a briefcase, another with a dog on a leash, and a woman who drew more than her share of glances. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, and carried herself with a brisk confidence that seemed out of place among the slower rhythms of village life. A smart hat shaded her eyes, but not enough to hide the sharp intelligence behind them. Nearby, the station master, an older man with a weathered face and a station cap slightly too large for his head, fumbled with a set of keys. He didn't look up as the woman passed, but his hands twitched nervously. Another man in a dark overcoat stepped closer to the office window and slipped an envelope through the slot. His gloved hand lingered on the edge of the slot for a moment, then vanished into a pocket. From her vantage point near the station's entrance, Miss Marple observed the scene. She noted the young woman's sharp glance toward the far end of the platform, where a shadow moved just out of sight. The woman's lips tightened, as though she had expected something else, and then she turned on her heel and walked toward the station's waiting room. The platform was nearly empty when the scream came. It was sharp and sudden, slicing through the mist like a blade. Passengers still lingering near the exit turned toward the source, eyes wide. The station master dropped his keys, and a man who'd been rummaging through his bag froze, his hand half buried in papers. Miss Marple, who had been about to leave, paused. The sound had come from the waiting room. She didn't run. Miss Marple never ran, but her steps quickened just enough to carry her inside before the crowd began to gather. The room was unremarkable. Wooden benches, a small stove in the corner, and a battered clock on the wall. But the locked compartment, a small private space set aside for lone travelers, was now the center of attention. The door was bolted from the inside, and when the station master managed to force it open, the scene inside was both shocking and perplexing. The young woman who had arrived just minutes ago now lay motionless on the floor. Her hat was still perfectly placed on her head, her gloves still buttoned, and her handbag, its clasp closed, was sitting on the bench beside her. There were no signs of a struggle, no shattered glass or overturned furniture. The door, bolted from within, seemed to mock anyone who might guess at what had happened. Miss Marple didn't say a word. She stood quietly at the back, her sharp eyes taking in the details. The placement of the handbag, the faint smudge on the window's edge, and the peculiar angle of the woman's shoes. As the station staff began to panic and the local inspector was sent for, Miss Marple stepped back into the misty morning. Her expression was unreadable, but the faint glimmer in her eyes suggested she was already assembling the pieces of the puzzle. The station, always quiet at that hour, had taken on a tense, almost stifling atmosphere. Outside, the fog hadn't lifted, and the faint dampness clung to every surface. Inside, the waiting room felt smaller than usual, crowded with pale faces and lowered voices. There was no escaping the locked compartment at the heart of it all. Its solid wooden door shut tight, refusing to give up its secrets. Inspector Bellingham arrived at the station just after 9. He moved with deliberate steps, his sturdy overcoat buttoned against the chill. The years since his retirement had done little to dull his keen eye, though he now carried himself with the air of a man who picked his battles carefully. When he saw Miss Marple standing to one side, her hands resting lightly on the handle of a handbag, his mouth quirked in a brief, knowing smile. He tipped his hat to her as he approached. "Morning, Miss Marple. I see you're already taking it all in." "Good morning, Inspector," she replied, her tone mild. "It seems the whole village is abuzz." The inspector gave a slight nod. Locked door, no sign of entry, no one saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. That sort of thing tends to stir up talk. Miss Marple said nothing, her expression unreadable. They stood there for a moment, side by side, observing the milling crowd of station staff, curious villagers, and a handful of passengers still lingering from the early train. In the confined space of the waiting room, the mixture of anxiety and morbid curiosity thickened the air. It wasn't just about the locked door, Miss Marple knew. It was about the story behind it. When Inspector Bellingham stepped forward to address the small gathering, she followed, her eyes roving over every detail. The pristine lock showed no sign of tampering. The young woman's handbag sat on the bench inside the compartment, its clasp undisturbed. A railway ticket lay just inches from the door, as if it had been dropped in haste or placed with care. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. She bent slightly, studying the ticket. It bore a faint smudge on one corner, the kind that might come from a damp glove. Not much of a clue on its own, but then again, no detail was too small. A slip of paper rested on the seat just behind the handbag. She reached for it carefully, noting the blotched tea stain that obscured part of the writing. What remained legible mentioned hidden corridors and something about a final meeting. The handwriting was neat, almost deliberate, as if someone wanted to ensure it would be read. But why leave it there? Why the tea spill and why the ticket on the floor? Each question added another layer to the puzzle. Inspector Bellingham joined her at the doorway. "Find anything?" he asked, his voice low enough not to carry. Miss Marple held up the note, her gloved fingers steady. "Something intriguing, though I suppose it might just be a red herring." The inspector chuckled softly. "You always did have a knack for seeing through those." As the morning wore on, the station's modest lounge filled with murmurs. Villagers huddled over cups of tea, their voices barely above whispers. The young woman, it turned out, was no ordinary traveler. An investigative journalist, they said, one who had been looking into questionable dealings on the railway. She had stayed in the village a few days prior, quiet and polite, but asking pointed questions. Perhaps too pointed. The more Miss Marple listened, the more the picture sharpened. By noon, the initial shock had given way to speculation. Miss Marple had overheard everything from smugglers' plots to ghostly revenge. But none of it felt right. She needed to sift through the noise to find the thread that tied it all together. Sitting in a quiet corner, she turned the ticket over in her hands and reread the note. Somewhere in the seemingly ordinary details she knew lay the answer. It was always the same in these matters: greed, jealousy, or fear. Maybe all three. The sound of a porcelain cup meeting its saucer brought her back to the present. Miss Marple lifted her gaze, watching the villagers as they talked in low tones. Their faces, their gestures, their slips of the tongue. All of it mattered. She had seen it before. When people believed no one was paying attention, they often revealed the most. And Miss Marple, calm and unassuming as ever, always paid attention, her lips pressed into a faint smile as she resolved to uncover every hidden truth. The station, the locked compartment, the young woman's meticulous note, none of it would remain a mystery for long. Miss Marple's day began the way most days in St. Mary Mead began, with tea and a list of quiet tasks. But beneath the usual routine, her mind worked in its deliberate, methodical way, turning over every oddity she'd observed in the hours since the woman's body was discovered. There were too many threads to leave unwoven. So she set out, as she often did, to listen, to watch. The first stop was a modest tea room on the village green where Lord Alistair Pembroke had taken up a corner table. His lordship was a fixture of St. Mary Mead, though not a particularly warm one. He had the sort of presence that could make the air seem colder. His stiffly tailored suit and slightly weathered face a perfect match for the small plate of neatly sliced bread and butter he ignored. "Lord Pembroke," Miss Marple said, seating herself without waiting for an invitation. "How fortuitous to find you here." He looked up, his grey eyes narrowing for a moment before he composed himself. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. How may I help you?" "I thought you might know something of the young lady found at the station." "Not at all. I never met her." His tone was polite, his words clipped, but his fingers twitched, just once, against the edge of his teacup. "A dreadful business. The police will handle it, I'm sure." "I'm sure they will, but you must have heard something," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft and unassuming as ever. "Such a tragedy so close to home. I wondered if you'd seen anything unusual." Pembroke shook his head. "Nothing at all. Now, if you'll excuse me," Miss Marple let him retreat, but not before noticing the slight tightening of his jaw and the flicker of something, fear, perhaps, that he quickly hid behind his usual aloof demeanour. Next came the railway engineer. Mr. John Ralston was known around the village, though less so these days. He used to be a man of status, overseeing the rail lines that connected St. Mary Mead to the wider world. Now he spent his mornings hunched at a corner table in the pub, a pint in hand before the sun was fully up. "Mr. Ralston," Miss Marple greeted, her tone warm as she slid into the seat across from him. He glanced at her, startled. "Miss Marple." His voice was rough, the words heavy. "What brings you here so early?" "Oh, I simply had a few questions," she said lightly. "It's been such a curious few days, hasn't it?" His hand tightened on the pint glass. "Don't know what you mean." "Why, the terrible business at the station, of course. You must have heard all about it." Ralston nodded slowly. "Heard about it, sure. Everyone has." Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly. "You worked on the railway for so many years. You must know things about that station that no one else does." His eyes flicked down, then away. "Not any more. Been years since I was there. Even so, you might recall something. Maybe an old entrance, or a room no one uses anymore." "No, nothing like that." He drained his glass in one swift motion and stood, muttering something about needing to be somewhere. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unchanged. She hadn't expected a confession, but his unease said plenty. A final stop that morning was the inn on the far side of the green, a modest place that catered to travellers too weary to continue their journeys. The mysterious traveller was there, a tall, thin man with a sharp face and piercing eyes. He sat near the window, gazing out at the street with an expression that made Miss Marple think of a cat watching a mouse. "Good morning," she said as she approached. "I believe you're new to the village." He turned slowly, his dark eyes landing on her as if she were something he'd been expecting. "I am. What can I do for you, madam?" "Oh, I was just curious. You were on the train yesterday, weren't you? The one that stopped before that awful business was discovered?" "Yes," he said simply, "I was." "And did you see anything unusual? Hear anything unusual?" He smiled faintly. "Not sure what counts as unusual in a place like this. Everyone here seems to know everyone else's business." Miss Marple chuckled lightly. "Oh, you might be surprised, but I do appreciate your time, and if you think of anything, you know where to find me." The man nodded once, but his gaze remained on her long after she turned away. It was a look Miss Marple recognized. Not fear, exactly, but the cautious awareness of someone who had things to hide. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple examined the items collected from the station. The muddy footprints stood out, strange, given the polished wooden floor. She'd seen them just outside the locked compartment, leading toward an unused exit. They didn't belong there, and yet they'd been there all the same. She turned her attention to the note found on the seat inside. The faint scent of expensive cologne still lingered, a clue that suggested the writer was not a common traveler. The handwriting, careful, deliberate, seemed familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. As the clock ticked on, Miss Marple recalled her conversations from the day. Lord Pembroke's icy demeanour, Ralston's jittery deflections, and the traveller's guarded replies all danced through her mind. Each encounter left her with questions, but also with a sense of direction. There were patterns here, subtle ones, that only made sense when viewed together. Miss Marple stood in the dimly lit archive room, brushing cobwebs from the lapel of her coat. The place had clearly not been touched in years. Dust hung in the air, turning every beam of light into a faint, glittering haze. The shelves, which stretched from floor to ceiling, groaned under the weight of old station logs, crumbling newspapers, and faded timetables bound with brittle twine. She moved cautiously between the stacks, the floorboards creaking beneath her step. Her gloved hand trailed over the spines of the forgotten records. On one shelf, a row of leather-bound ledgers leaned precariously. She pulled one out at random. It was heavy with age, its cover warped, and the ink inside faded to the color of weak tea. She flipped through it carefully, pausing when something caught her eye. A series of expenditures for building materials, listed under vague project names. A large sum was recorded as being spent on renovation sometime in the 1880s. The details were scarce, but the date stood out. That was the period when the station had undergone its last major refurbishment, or so she'd heard in the village. She returned the ledger and turned her attention to the bottom drawers of a tall filing cabinet. It took some effort, but she managed to wrench one open. Inside were a few faded envelopes, yellowed receipts, and at the very back, a rolled-up set of blueprints. She drew it out and spread it carefully over a clear desk. The paper crinkled as she smoothed it flat. The station's original layout was there in black and white, but there were faint pencil marks as well, modifications sketched in by someone's hand long after the station had been built. The pencil notes pointed to changes behind the main platform, and a line leading to a small symbol she recognized as an indication of stairs or a hatch. The passage wasn't marked on any of the official plans. It was as if someone had decided to keep it from the record. The more she studied the blueprints, the more certain she became there was a concealed route through the station, one long forgotten but still present, perhaps even still usable. As the afternoon light faded, she rolled the blueprint back up and replaced it in the drawer. She would return later to inspect the exact spot. For now, the knowledge that the locked compartment wasn't as secure as it seemed gave her plenty to consider. When Miss Marple returned to the archive room that evening, she brought a small flashlight borrowed from the station master. The faint beam flickered over the rows of old books and files, catching the edges of carved wooden shelves that seemed far older than the room itself. The blueprints' rough measurements had indicated a spot along the north wall, where an antique bookshelf now stood. The air grew colder as she approached it, as if the weight of all those years had settled into the wood. She ran her fingers along the shelf's edge, feeling for anything unusual. A latch, perhaps, or a loose panel. At first, there was nothing. Just the gritty sensation of dust and the smoothness of worn oak. But then, near the bottom corner, her fingers brushed against a slight depression, almost like a hidden catch. It took only a gentle push. The bookshelf gave a faint groan, then shifted inward. Behind it, the faint outline of a narrow passage came into view. Cobwebs draped the entrance like a curtain, and the scent of damp earth rose from the depths beyond. She angled the flashlight down the corridor and saw a narrow, uneven floor that disappeared into shadow. Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the dark. Her shoes disturbed a thin layer of dust, leaving clear prints on the ground. The corridor wasn't long, but it was just wide enough for a single person to move through. The walls were rough brick, patched in places with wooden slats that seemed ready to give way. She reached a fork in the passage and paused. One path led to a rusted metal door, bolted from this side. The other seemed to lead back toward the station platform. There was no time to investigate further that evening, but she had seen enough. The passage was real, and it proved the locked compartment wasn't as impenetrable as it appeared. Someone had known about this corridor and used it to slip in and out unseen. Miss Marple turned and made her way back, carefully pushing the bookshelf into place behind her. She would return with the proper authorities, of course, but for now, she had another piece of the puzzle. As she emerged from the archive room, the distant sound of the station's clock striking the hour echoed through the still air. The village outside remained quiet, unaware of the secrets that had lain just below the surface all these years. The sitting room in Miss Marple's cottage was a small, comfortable place, filled with the sort of quiet order that made clear no detail was ever overlooked. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting faint flickers of light onto a well-worn notebook that rested on her lap. She sat, not at her writing desk, but in her favorite armchair by the window, where she could glance out at the street whenever she needed a moment to think. The notebook was filled with her careful notes and sketches. On one page, a rough diagram of the station's hidden corridor stretched across the paper, lines and arrows neatly marked with dates and initials. Another page held a list of names, each suspect paired with a set of observations. The disgraced engineer's name had a note, fidgeted when asked about old stairwells. Next to Lord Alistair Pembroke's name were the words, "Fear in his eyes despite composure." The mysterious traveller was noted simply as Shadow, always watching. Her pencil moved lightly over the paper as she circled a phrase she had written earlier, "the scent of cologne." It still lingered in her mind. The blueprints, the footprints, the tea-stained note, all of it connected, but the picture wasn't complete. As she thought, her gaze drifted out the window, and the village green came into view. A milk cart rattled by, the driver tipping his hat to a passing pedestrian. The daily rhythms of St. Mary Mead went on as if nothing had happened. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface, things were shifting. The fire popped, and the sound brought her back. With a slow, deliberate motion, she turned to another page of her notebook. This one contained a timeline, trains arriving and departing, witnesses who had seen the young woman that morning, and the approximate time the scream had been heard. Flashbacks of her conversations returned to her, each voice distinct: Lord Pembroke's curt dismissal, Ralston's nervous tone, the traveller's measured, watchful responses. Each memory sharpened the outline of the truth in her mind. After several minutes of silence, she placed her pencil down. The faint trace of a smile crossed her face, though it was more a reflection of resolve than triumph. She had work to do. Rising from her chair, she picked up her notebook and slipped it into her handbag. There were people she needed to see again, questions she needed to ask differently. She straightened her cardigan, set her hat in place, and walked out of the cottage, closing the door softly behind her. It was a crisp afternoon and the village square was bustling. The market stalls were lined with produce, baked goods, and small household wares. Children darted between the stands while their mothers examined rows of jars and baskets of apples. The shopkeeper, a tall man in a tweed jacket, was rearranging a stack of tins when Miss Marple approached. "Good day, Mrs. Marple," he said with a polite nod. "Looking for anything in particular?" "Not at all, Mr. Jenkins," she replied. "But I was wondering, did you hear about Lord Pembroke returning recently?" Jenkins hesitated, his hands pausing mid-motion. "Yes, well, I heard something about that. Came back a few weeks ago, I believe. Odd timing, what with the trouble at the station and all." "Quite," she said, her tone light. "And did he seem any different?" "Different? I don't know about that. Maybe more on edge. But then he's always been a bit reserved. Can't say I blame him. Old families like that, they carry a lot of baggage." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Quite right. She moved on, weaving through the market with a pace that seemed casual, though her mind was far from idle. At a stall selling preserves, she paused to exchange a few words with the seller, a woman who had always been keen on village gossip. "Mrs. Trainer," Miss Marple said with a warm smile, "how are you today?" "Oh, getting by," Mrs. Trainer replied. "And yourself, Mrs. Marple?" "I'm well, thank you. I wondered if you'd noticed anyone unusual around the station recently. I heard talk of a man in a dark overcoat." Mrs. Trainer frowned, her hand hesitating over a jar of jam. "Now that you mention it, I did see someone just the other evening. Tall fellow, kept his head down, looked like he didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And where was this?" "Near the side entrance, just before dusk. Seemed in a hurry." "Interesting," Miss Marple said, her voice still light, though her mind was already piecing this detail into the larger picture. She thanked Mrs. Trainer and moved along. The market chatter faded as Miss Marple walked back toward the green. Her questions had been answered in ways that were small, subtle, but revealing. Lord Pembroke's return at a peculiar moment, a shadowy figure lingering near the station, the faint scent of cologne on a piece of evidence that didn't quite match the scene. Each clue added another thread to the web she was weaving, and if she pulled the right thread, the entire pattern would come into view. Miss Marple's steps quickened as she made her way back to her cottage. She had enough for now. The key players in the village assembly would be gathered soon, and she intended to be ready. For the moment, she would take a few quiet hours to review her notes once more. Then she would make her move. The village hall was built to impress, but only just. Heavy oak beams lined the ceiling, and the walls carried the faint sheen of recent polish, as though someone had hurriedly scrubbed away the scuff marks and fingerprints of years gone by. The brass sconces flickered faintly, throwing unsteady shadows across the rows of wooden chairs that were quickly filling with familiar faces. Miss Marple sat at the head of a long table, her posture as upright as a schoolmistress about to address her class. Next to her, Inspector Bellingham leaned back in his chair, his arms folded loosely. His eyes, though seemingly at rest, darted from one guest to the next, cataloguing every twitch and fidget. The two of them said nothing at first, content to let the low murmur of conversation roll through the room like an incoming tide. Lord Pembroke was one of the first to arrive, moving with deliberate steps that didn't quite disguise his unease. He took a seat near the front, carefully avoiding anyone's eyes. The railway engineer, John Ralston, shuffled in shortly after, his hat clutched tightly in both hands. He looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else, but a quick glance from Miss Marple as he entered stopped him from turning back. He sat far from Pembroke, his gaze darting nervously between the floor and the door. A small, thin man in a dark overcoat appeared next, the traveller. His every movement seemed calculated, from the way he adjusted his collar to the slight tilt of his head as he scanned the room. He chose a seat near the middle, not too close to anyone, but close enough to listen. As more faces filed in, shopkeepers, housewives, a few farmers who hadn't yet finished their evening chores, the hum of conversation grew. Bits of gossip and theory floated up, muffled but unmistakable. The locked compartment, the scream, the note. And now, whispers of a hidden passage. All the ingredients for a mystery sat in the air, and every person in that room felt the weight of it pressing down on their shoulders. Inspector Bellingham leaned over to Miss Marple. "Quite the turnout," he said under his breath. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People do love a good story. Well, let's hope this one has a proper ending." When the hall had settled into a strained silence, Miss Marple rose from her chair. She took a moment to glance around the room. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others wary. The large windows behind her let in the fading twilight, casting the long table and its occupants in a dusky, uncertain light. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice calm and measured. "I know it's been a trying few days for the village." The room stayed silent, except for the occasional creak of a chair or the soft clink of a teacup being set down. Miss Marple took a slow step forward. her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "We've all heard the facts. A young woman tragically killed in what appeared to be a locked room with no way in or out, a note that hinted at secrets we can only guess, and more recently, a hidden corridor that some of you may not have even known existed." Her eyes moved over the group, pausing briefly on each of the main suspects. Pembroke's gaze dropped. Ralston swallowed hard. The traveller remained still, his expression unreadable. What we have before us is not a simple accident or a random act. It is, quite plainly, a crime. But the key to solving it lies not in the obvious facts, because the obvious facts have been arranged to mislead. The answers lie in the small details. She turned her attention to the table, where the evidence was laid out. The railway ticket, its corner smudged, the note, still faintly scented with expensive cologne, the rough sketch of the corridor she had traced from memory after examining the blueprints. "Take this ticket," she said, holding it up. "At first glance it tells us very little. A passenger dropped it, or perhaps it slipped out of a pocket, but it's the placement that matters. It wasn't left casually on a seat or the floor of the compartment. It was found just outside the locked door, where it could be easily seen, almost as though someone wanted it noticed." She set the ticket down and picked up the note. "And this?" A cryptic message about hidden corridors, partially obscured by a tea stain, a clever way to distract us, to send our attention toward a larger, more theatrical story while hiding a much simpler truth. Her voice stayed even, calm, but her words sharpened the atmosphere in the room. Faces tightened, hands gripped the edges of chairs. The tension was tangible, hanging heavy over every head. She stepped back, clasping her hands once more. "I won't accuse anyone here without clear evidence. But I can tell you this, someone in this room knows far more than they've admitted. And the details we've uncovered, the footprints, the corridor, the notes, will lead us to them. Because the truth, as it always does, leaves a trail. It only requires patience and observation to see it clearly." Miss Marple's voice softened slightly. "We will find out who did this, and when we do, we will understand not only what happened, but why it happened." The silence that followed her words was deep, the kind that made people shift in their seats, glance at each other without speaking, and question their own thoughts. Miss Marple remained standing for a moment longer, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. Then, with a polite nod, she returned to her seat, leaving the weight of her words to settle where they would. The chapter ended not with a grand revelation, but with a growing sense of anticipation. The suspects, the villagers, and even the readers would have to wait a little longer. But the path was becoming clearer, and Miss Marple, as always, had her eye firmly on the truth. The heavy silence in the village hall was broken only by the faint ticking of a wall clock, the sound seeming louder than it should in the strained quiet. Miss Marple stood at the head of the room, her expression calm and composed. Her eyes settled on Lord Alistair Pembroke, who sat with his back straight, his hands gripping the arms of his chair just a little too tightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice low and measured, "we have pieced together the events surrounding that terrible morning at the station. It was not an accident, nor a random act of violence. What we have here is a carefully constructed crime, intended to mislead, to appear impossible." Her gaze shifted across the room, catching the attention of every suspect, before resting again on Pembroke. "Let us start at the beginning," she said, stepping slowly to one side of the table. "The locked compartment. At first glance, an impenetrable space, the door bolted from the inside, no sign of forced entry. Yet the train schedule, which I reviewed carefully, tells us that the express was delayed. This allowed just enough time for a hidden entry and exit." She paused, allowing her words to hang in the air. "The hidden corridor," she continued, "a relic of a long-ago renovation, known only to a few. Its access point disguised behind a bookshelf in the station's archives. The blueprints, which I retrieved and studied, clearly show a direct route from that corridor to the platform just outside the compartment." She leaned lightly on the table, looking down at her notes. Not only does this explain how the assailant entered the locked compartment, it tells us that whoever committed this act had detailed knowledge of the station's construction. She straightened again, fixing her gaze on Pembroke. Lord Pembroke has always been known as a private man, someone who values discretion. But he has other, less well-known qualities, such as a deep familiarity with the station's history. After all, it was his grandfather who oversaw the renovations that added that corridor. And Lord Pembroke himself handled the estate records for many years, including those detailing the station's original plans. The faint creak of a chair broke the tension as Pembroke shifted slightly, his calm exterior beginning to crack. Miss Marple's voice never wavered. "The motive, I believe, is the final piece. The young woman found dead in that compartment was an investigative journalist. She had spent weeks looking into rumors of smuggling operations conducted through our very own St. Mary Mead station. Illegal shipments of goods moved under cover of darkness without a trace. A lucrative business for whoever was at the center of it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had uncovered enough evidence to bring the whole network down. Lord Pembroke, as the primary benefactor of that network, could not afford to have her findings made public. A few gasps escaped from the audience, and Pembroke's face, so carefully composed a moment ago, now showed a glimmer of panic. His mouth tightened and his fingers whitened against the chair's wooden arms. Pembroke's voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "This is preposterous. You have no real proof, just speculation and conjecture." Miss Marple regarded him evenly. "The proof is in the details, Lord Pembroke. The unusual placement of the railway ticket, dropped deliberately, I suspect, to divert attention. The note with a faint trace of cologne, matching the scent you often wear. The timing of the train's delay, which was communicated by your private secretary, who conveniently had access to the station schedules. All of these threads point in one direction." Pembroke rose to his feet. "You have no evidence," he repeated louder this time. "No witnesses, nothing to substantiate these wild claims." A soft voice spoke from the back of the hall. "Perhaps you should tell her about that night." The entire room turned. A man in a dark overcoat stepped forward, his face partially shadowed by the dim lighting. It was the mysterious traveler who had been seen near the station, the same man Miss Marple had questioned briefly days earlier. "You told me it would be simple," the man said, his voice low. "You said she wouldn't be missed for days, that I'd just deliver the message, make sure she went into that compartment, and you'd handle the rest." He looked down at his hands. "I didn't know you'd kill her." Pembroke's face blanched. "You're a liar, a common criminal." The man shrugged. "Maybe so, but I'm not the one who planned it all. I just did what you paid me to do." Inspector Bellingham stepped forward, nodding toward his constables. "I think that's enough," he said quietly. The two officers moved toward Pembroke, who seemed to deflate before their eyes. He offered no resistance, just a heavy, weary sigh as they took him by the arms. Miss Marple watched silently as Pembroke was led away, followed closely by the man in the overcoat. The villagers began to murmur among themselves, their hushed conversations filled with shock, disbelief, and, at least in some corners, satisfaction. The locked room, the hidden passage, the scattered clues, all of it had pointed inevitably to this conclusion. As the hall emptied, Miss Marple remained seated at the long table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She glanced at Inspector Bellingham, who raised an eyebrow. "Well," he said, "I don't think there's much left to discuss." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "No, I suppose not, though I imagine there will be plenty of talk in the village for some time." Bellingham chuckled. "Always is." He leaned down slightly. "You were right about him from the start, weren't you?" "I only followed the threads," she replied. "They all lead somewhere if one has the patience to see where they go." Bellingham nodded. "I suppose that's the trick. Patience." Miss Marple rose from her chair, her handbag swinging lightly at her side. "Patience, Inspector, and a very keen eye." St. Mary Mead had always been a place that thrived on routine. The baker's boy passed the same houses at the same hour every morning. The postman's whistle sounded at exactly 9 o'clock. The village green, bordered by cottages with tidy gardens, was never empty for long. In the days after Lord Pembroke's arrest, however, the rhythm had faltered, if only slightly. The tea room on the corner was packed, not just with regulars but with villagers who rarely sat still long enough for a cup of tea. They huddled at small tables, their voices low but animated. The subject on everyone's lips was, of course, the revelations of the past week. The locked room, the hidden passage, the shocking unmasking of Pembroke. It all seemed like something out of a serial novel. Miss Marple sat near the window, her tea untouched and cooling. She wasn't listening, least not in any obvious way, but the threads of conversation reached her all the same, bits of gossip, fragments of opinion. Pembroke had always been odd, someone said. The engineer had looked guilty from the start, claimed another, and that traveller, the foreign one, he must have been involved somehow too. She let their words drift past her and turned her gaze to the street outside. A man in a flat cap was hammering new hinges onto a gate that had hung crooked for months. Two children darted across the cobblestones, laughing, their games oblivious to the recent drama. A cart rattled by, its driver calling out to someone unseen. Life in St. Mary Mead was regaining its equilibrium, but it was a careful balance, as though the village knew how fragile peace could be. Miss Marple's hand moved absently to the saucer, her fingers brushing the edge of the cup. Her thoughts were not on the chatter around her, but on the cost of what had been revealed. Lives changed, trust shaken. Justice served, yes, but at a price. She finally lifted the cup and took a sip, the tea now tepid. Outside, the man with the gate had finished his work, the children had disappeared down another lane, the cart's clatter had faded into the distance. St. Mary Mead was slowly returning to itself. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair by the fire. The notebook lay open on the side table, but she wasn't writing just yet. Instead, she held a pen lightly in her hand, her gaze fixed on the pages. They were filled with neat script, diagrams, and dates. A record of the case, start to finish. She had done this before and would likely do it again, a habit perhaps, but also a way to make sense of what could never be undone. Her thoughts returned to the key moments, the locked room that seemed unbreakable, the secret corridor that revealed how simple it all was once the veil was lifted, the lies that had been told, the truths that had emerged. She thought of Pembroke, his carefully maintained facade shattered, his fear finally exposed, and she thought of the young woman whose life had been taken, the weight of that loss pressing down on every word she had written. Miss Marple set the pen down and closed the notebook. She rose from the chair and moved to the window. The sky outside was deepening into twilight. Shadows stretched long across the green, and the first lamps had begun to flicker on. The village was quiet now, almost serene, but she knew better. Beneath the surface, beneath the polished brass and the tidy hedgerows, there were always secrets, always something waiting to be uncovered. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not of satisfaction, but of understanding. Justice had been served, yet the work was never truly done. People were people, capable of greed, jealousy, and fear. But they were also capable of resilience, of rebuilding, of moving on. St. Mary Mead would heal, and so would she in her own quiet way. Miss Marple turned from the window and extinguished the lamp. The room plunged into the soft shadows of evening. The faint smell of the fire lingered in the air as she climbed the narrow staircase to her bedroom. The day was done, the truth laid bare, and tomorrow the village would begin again with its slow rhythm and its simple routine. But for now all was calm, and that was enough. Tasks,